Alright, what's up everybody? Today I want to share with you guys how I've set up my Sony A7 IV for cinematic video and photos, and overall just to get the most out of this camera. This camera has a lot of bang for its buck and is quickly becoming one of my favorite cameras to shoot with, and it's definitely worth the upgrade coming from the Sony A7 III. Personally, one of my favorite upgrades about this camera has got to be the 4K at 10-bit 422 for much richer colors. Nowadays I am filming with this camera as my B camera and my Sony A7S III as my A camera, but I know a lot of you guys are wondering how I set up this camera, so I wanted to create this video today to kind of break down all the settings that I've set up on this camera. And keep in mind, although I'm going to be sharing with you guys my Sony A7 IV settings, you can also use these exact same settings for your A7S III, your FX3, or even the FX30. Generally, any of the newer Sony cameras with the exact same menu layout. I'll also be sharing with you guys my custom button layout, so that way you can be very quick and efficient while you're outside filming, and that way you don't need to constantly be digging into your settings. But feel free to mix and choose what you want to take from these settings and layouts and, you know, customize it to your own liking. But personally, this is how I like to set up my camera. I've also left some timestamps for each section, so that way you guys can quickly kind of come back to this video and kind of find which settings you want to change if that's what you want to do. But I highly recommend watching all the way through so you don't miss anything important. But without further ado, let's jump into it. So first, I'll be covering the video settings, then I'll be covering the photo settings, and then I'll be covering the custom button layout. Now, on the Sony A7 IV, there is a photo and video dial where you can switch between photo and video mode, and I believe this is only found on the Sony A7 IV. But don't worry, if you're working with a different Sony camera, you can still follow along on your Sony A7S III, your FX3, or even your FX30. Just make sure to spin your dial onto the movie dial, and then you should see the exact same menu setup as me. So we'll start off by making sure that we are on the movie dial on the Sony A7 IV, and then we're going to spin our dial over to manual, so that way we can control and change all the settings without being restricted by the auto settings. So now diving into the menu system and jumping into image quality and into file format. I have mine set to XAVCS 4K, and I really like this file format because the files aren't massive like on the XAVC-SI file formats, and it's not too compressed like it is on the XAVC-HS 4K. So I find the XAVC-S 4K a good middle ground. And personally, I've tested out all these different file formats, and honestly, you cannot tell the difference at all in terms of image quality. So since I'm creating mainly YouTube and Instagram content nowadays, I much rather prefer this file format in order just to save as much space as I can without also having to, you know, reduce my image quality. Moving on to movie settings, and let's go ahead and just leave that at 24p for now. We'll go ahead and change this a little bit later, but make sure to also change this to 100 megabytes 422 10-bit, because that's how you're going to be able to get the best quality and colors out of your shots. And I feel like that's one of the best parts about this camera, so definitely make sure to take advantage of it. Moving into S&Q function, personally I don't use S&Q for slow motion shots just because you aren't able to record sound when you do use this mode, but I do use this mode when I do want to film quick time lapses instead of how you would take a time lapse where you would have to take like over hundreds of different photos, and then you would have to edit and process it, which kind of takes a really long time and also eats up a lot of storage. So I find S&Q mode a really good way to kind of save space and also to quickly film those quick time lapses that, you know, are not so important. For more important stuff like my Astro time lapses, I wouldn't recommend this mode, but for most of my time lapses, it's perfect. So I've set my record frame rate to 24p, and that just means that it's going to play back at 24 frames per second. And I've also set my frame rate to 2 frames per second, which means it's going to record every 2 frames per second. And you can kind of play around with this. Typically I kind of float around between 4, 8, and 2, but we can just leave that at 2 frames per second for now. And then recording settings will actually be 100 megabits 422 at 10-bit, just so once again we can maximize that 10-bit 422 colors. Moving on into proxy settings, and basically what this does is that while you're filming your original footage, it's also simultaneously recording proxies. So instead of creating proxies inside your editing software, you know, which could take up to like 30 minutes to a couple hours depending on how much footage you have, you can skip that process entirely because your camera has already created all the proxies, and now all you have to do is just attach them to your original footage, which literally has saved me hours and hours of waiting time. So absolutely love this feature. If your computer ever lags or struggles to edit this H.265 422 10-bit footage, using proxies will drastically improve your editing speed to where there is almost like 0% lag, which is extremely valuable if you don't have the latest and greatest computer. One of the biggest bottlenecks that I had while editing was that it was always freezing and lagging and glitching out, but with the proxies I'm barely ever experiencing that at all nowadays, and actually made editing fun again for me. As for my proxy file format, I've just left it at XAVC HD, and by default it should be at 6 megabytes 420 8-bit, so good enough for proxies. Let's move on. Now moving on to APS-C shooting, and I've left that on auto mode, and basically what this does is that if you ever put on a APS-C lens, it will automatically crop into APS-C mode. Now let's move on and skip some of these settings which are not really that important to configure. And moving on to record media settings. Now I actually have my photos recording onto slot 2 and then my videos recording onto slot 1. And also auto switching media is set on. Skipping over some of these settings that are not very important as of right now, and moving on into audio recording. Make sure that audio recording is turned on, and make sure to lower your audio recording level. I believe by default it comes out at around like 24 or 25, but I find when you use an external microphone it's extremely loud and I always get clipping sound, so make sure to lower that to around like 12 or 15. I personally have that on 12. And then make sure wind noise reduction is turned off, or else your audio will sound really muffled. And then I also have audio level display turned on, so that way I can see my audio levels while I am filming. So now moving on, we're gonna go ahead and skip all this stuff and moving into image stabilization. And I actually have steady shot on active mode, which is Sony's in-body digital stabilization, which is actually pretty good. I'm able to get some pretty steady handheld shots with this turned on, so I definitely recommend it. Keep in mind though, there is a slight crop when you do use this, but like I said, it's actually pretty good and it's definitely worth it. Steady shot adjust, I've just left that as auto, and now we can kind of just move on. Moving into shooting display, I personally have my grid lines turned on, and I have set my grid line type into diagonal plus square grid. And basically what this is that it just shows me these grid lines over here, which really helps with framing for my shots. Super useful. Highly recommend you guys turn that on. We're gonna go ahead and keep moving on, and we're gonna go into white balance. So personally, I actually have my white balance set to auto, and for the majority of the time, the auto white balance actually does a really great job. So we're gonna go ahead and just leave that on auto for now, but we will set up a custom button later on, so that way we can adjust our white balance if we need to. But for the most part, auto white balance, I would say about like 80 to 90% of the time nails it for me. So we're going ahead and just leave that on auto, and we're not gonna really touch these settings. Left this as standard and this as 1. So now moving into color tone and into picture profile, we're gonna turn that on, and we're actually gonna just hit right on PP1 and change this into gamma S-Log3, and then the color mode as S-Gamma3 Cine, and that's it. We're not gonna change anything else, and we're just gonna save that as PP1. I highly recommend filming in S-Log3 if you want the most dynamic range and colors out of your shots. On older Sony cameras with the 8-bit colors, it was never really that ideal to film in S-Log3 because it tends to kind of fall apart. But now with the 10-bit colors out of these newer cameras, we're able to finally utilize this picture profile and kind of get all the benefits of it without having all the footage fall apart. And the colors are absolutely amazing. The camera is so powerful, and it truly does feel like you have a cinema camera in your hands with the quality that you're getting out of this thing for only a fraction of the price of a real cinema camera. If you guys want to get the exact same colors as me with just a few clicks, then make sure to check out my S-Log3 LUTs. These are my own custom LUTs that I use for all my footage, which really helps speed up the color grading process and makes it a whole lot easier. So if you guys do want to support the channel, a link will be found down below in the description. Now moving into soft skin effect, I personally don't use this, but I think this would be a really great effect for some of you guys who are maybe shooting like beauty stuff, or maybe some female creators. But yeah, I'm gonna leave that off for now, but just letting you know that that option is there. Moving into zebra display. Now I personally do not use zebra display to expose my footage. I find it really annoying and really distracting, and honestly you can't really see what you're composing, so I personally don't use it. So we're gonna go ahead and just leave that off and kind of skip over it. Moving into autofocus and manual focus. For my focus mode, I'm gonna leave it on continuous autofocus since we are dealing with video mode, and autofocus transition speed is set to 5. What this does is it will affect how fast the focus will snap onto your subject. My autofocus subject shift sensitivity is set to 3, and basically what this does is it will control how fast your autofocus will shift onto a different subject if it were to enter into your frame. And I've left autofocus assist on off. Now moving into focus area, and I actually have my focus area set to zone, but I do occasionally switch, which I have set a custom button, which we'll cover a little bit later, but for now we're just gonna leave it at zone. That's gonna be it for this tab. We're gonna just move on now. And now moving into face and eye autofocus, make sure to turn this on. Face and eye subject as human, right and left eye select to auto, and make sure to turn on face and eye frame display. This helps you kind of see that you are tracking the face and the eye, so I actually like that turned on. And also make sure to turn on register faces priority. The face tracking is absolutely incredible on this camera, so definitely make sure to turn that on and take advantage of that. Now moving on to peaking display, we're actually going to leave this off for now, and we will set up a custom button later so we can turn that on and off, but I do use the peaking display for manual focusing. So now moving on, and we can actually skip over a lot of these tabs over here and into the very last tab. We can go into finder and monitor, and personally I have left this on auto, so whenever I want to take a photo with the viewfinder, it will automatically switch into the viewfinder mode, but this could be something that you might want to turn off. For example, if you're using the A7 IV on a gimbal or something and the eyepiece is constantly touching the back of the gimbal, it will constantly think that your eye is on the monitor, and it will constantly turn off just like this when I'm kind of just like throwing my finger in front of it. So yeah, that could be really annoying, kind of depending on how you like to use this camera, but for me, auto is good enough. And you can also set a custom button for a little bit later, which we'll actually cover. Now moving on to monitor brightness, and I recommend turning it on to sunny weather. This will drain your batteries just a little bit faster, but I definitely recommend it because sometimes it can be really hard to see your LCD monitor in the bright day. Sunny weather is super helpful, highly recommend. And then go ahead and change your finder frame rate into high, and then from there we can actually now move on. Moving into display options, and make sure to go ahead and turn on gamma display assist. This is really important for helping you expose S-Log3 correctly. Basically what this does is that it will help you see what your S-Log3 footage would look like after it's been corrected into a Rec 709 color space. It doesn't bake it into the final footage, it just helps you see what it would look like while you're filming so you can nail your exposure. Because sometimes looking at a super flat and dull log profile can be really hard to kind of tell if you're properly exposed or kind of even see your exposure. So having that turned on really helps all that stuff out. Once you have that turned on, we can just move on from here. Now moving on to this very last setting over here, which is power setting option. Make sure to turn auto power off temp into high, because your A7 IV will overheat after about 30 minutes of filming. I've actually tested this out, and right around like 30 to 35 minutes, my A7 IV will just shut off because it actually gets too hot. But if you actually switch it over into high, it won't shut off, and you can continuously keep recording unless your camera gets like really hot, then it'll probably just shut by itself. But once I've actually changed this into high, I haven't experienced any overheating issues, and it hasn't shut off on me ever since. So if you're having any problems with overheating, make sure to turn this on high. Okay, so while we are still in the video settings, let's go ahead and set up our custom presets into our dial 1, 2, and 3. So we're gonna go out into our camera settings, and let's actually change our shutter speed into 1/50. Let's open up our aperture to the widest possible. Personally, I just like filming in the widest aperture. You might wanna change this depending on what you like to use. And then let's actually change our ISO to 800, which is the base ISO for S-Log3 on the A7 IV. Make sure you have all that correct, because once we do save it into our dial 1, it's going to save the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. So it's really important that you get it right now. So let's go back into the menu system now, and we're going to go all the way back up into image quality, and we're just going to make sure that our frame rate is at 24 frames per second, and we're at 100 megabytes at 422 10-bit. Once we're good there, we can actually go into shooting mode, and then we're going to go into camera set memory. Go ahead and save that onto your dial 1. Once you have that saved, you can quickly access your 24 frames per second preset on your dial 1. But let's go ahead and configure our dial 2 for our 60 frames per second preset. So we're going to go back into our camera, and then we're going to change it into 1/125 shutter speed. We can keep the aperture and the ISO as the same, and now we can just go back into our menu, change our frame rate into 60 frames per second, this time, and make sure that we're at the highest recording settings, which is 200 megabytes at 422 at 10-bit. Once we have that down, we can go back into shooting mode and go into camera set memory, save these settings onto our number 2 dial, so that way we can quickly, change into 60 frames per second without having to, dig into our settings. So last but not least, we're gonna go ahead and actually move our shutter speed into 1/250, which we're gonna save this onto our dial 3 for 120 frames per second. We're gonna go back into menu and go into image quality, and for the A7 IV, we cannot film in 4K 10-bit 422 in 120 frames per second, so we're gonna actually have to lower our file format into XAVC HD, which is 1080p footage. But keep in mind, on your Sony A7S III or your FX3, you can just leave it at 4K and you can film at 120 frames per second at 10-bit 422. This is only for the A7 IV, but yeah, let's go ahead and lower this back into HD, and then from here we can change our movie settings into 120 frames per second. Make sure this is at the highest recording settings, which is 100 megabytes at 420 8-bit. And then from here we're going to go back into shooting mode and camera set memory and save this onto dial 3. So now every time I spin into dial 1, I'm instantly into 24 frames per second, and I have my shutter speed configured correctly. If I move into dial 2 now, I'm in 60 frames per second and my shutter speed is configured correctly, and if I want to go into 120, that's configured perfectly as well. This is really important to set up so you can quickly change between your frame rates with just a switch of the dial, instead of having to constantly dig into your settings and changing it around while you're out on a shoot. So this saves you a lot of time and makes shooting a lot more easier. Alright, so now let's go ahead and configure our photo settings, and we're actually going to spin our dial into now the photo mode on our A7 IV. And if you're on the A7S III or the FX3, just make sure to spin your dial into manual mode, and then you should be able to see the exact same menu layout as me. I'm gonna make sure to spin my dial into manual as well on my A7 IV, and we should be able to quickly cover the photo settings because we've already configured most of it, which is very similar to the video settings. So there's just a few different things that we need to change in here. But jumping right into the menu system and into image quality, the very first thing, I personally left this on JPEG, and I believe these HEIF files are a little bit more compressed if you want to save more files, but personally I'm happy with JPEG. And I actually don't even shoot JPEGs anyways. I shoot most of my photos in RAW, so that doesn't really even matter. We're gonna now move into image quality settings, and then we're actually gonna change our file format into RAW. Feel free to change this around if you want to also take a JPEG with your RAWs, but personally I almost always shoot RAWs and I edit all my photos anyways, so I prefer just shooting in RAW. My RAW file type is gonna be uncompressed, so that way I can get the highest quality RAWs out of my photos. You might want to change it if you want to save a little bit more storage in your photos, but personally I'm happy with uncompressed. Moving on into aspect ratio, I've set mine to 3:2. File format will not matter because we are in photo mode, but just make sure to just change this over into 4K. Just ever forget to like spin your dial into video mode or something, so just leave that in 4K. We're gonna skip over movie settings because this is photo settings. Moving into long exposure noise reduction, make sure to turn that off. If you leave this on, your camera will actually add like digital noise reduction inside your photo, and it's much better to actually just add the noise reduction inside Lightroom, so I definitely recommend turning that off. All right, so now moving on, we're gonna go ahead and skip over a lot of these settings over here, and into shooting display, just make sure your grid line is turned on, which it should be, and make sure to change your grid line type into diagonal plus square grid. Personally, that's what I like to use. You can feel free to change that around if you like. We're gonna go ahead and skip over a lot of these settings because we've already configured them inside the video mode. All right, now moving on, we're gonna go ahead and skip over a lot of this stuff and into color tone. Just make sure to turn off your picture profile when you are taking photos, and don't worry, this won't turn it off for your video as long as you're using your dial 1, 2, and 3. You've already saved the S-Log3 picture profile on those dials, so every time you spin into dial 1, 2, and 3 in your video mode, it will automatically turn on your picture profile, but you can leave this off for now because you are going to be taking photos. Since we are shooting raw photos, you don't need to actually turn on picture profiles when you are taking photos. It doesn't affect the photos at all, but it just kind of makes it a little harder to see what your final photo will actually look like, and also makes it a little harder to expose because you're seeing a log profile. So make sure to turn that off and just use the standard picture profile, as that's going to be the closest to what your photos are actually going to look like when you take it into Lightroom. Now with that, we're basically done setting up our entire photo and video settings. Now we just need to cover the custom button layouts. All right, so now moving on into configuring our custom button layout. And I just want to say these are personally my custom buttons that I like to use on this camera. Feel free to customize it to your liking or just follow along, but let's just jump into it. So we're going to go into the menu, and now we're going to go all the way down into the very last tab, and we're going to go into operation customize, and we're just going to select this first one over here, custom key dial settings, and this will affect your photo and video custom keys. So let's just go into that, and just starting off with the very first one right over here. I have my very first one set to peaking display select, so that way I can turn on and off my peaking display. Moving into the first one over here, I've actually set my peaking display select into this button right over here, which I can turn on and off very quickly, which is very handy. And now moving on to the next one, I actually have my autofocus and manual focus selector toggle on this button over here, so I can quickly change from manual focus and autofocus. This is a super handy one that I use quite often. And moving into the third one over here, which is C1, this little button over here, I've actually mapped it out to autofocus tracking sensitivity. Moving into C3, this button right over here, I actually have it configured to monitor brightness, so that way I can adjust it if I wanted to kind of lower the brightness or even brightness. Now moving on to the fifth one over here, which is mapped out to be my APS-C crop mode, which is more recommended for the A7 IV since we are dealing with 33 megapixels in our sensor, and this is just a great way to be able to get like a little bit more zoom out of your lenses, so I'm a big fan of using that. But for A7S III or the FX3, I do not recommend this since there is only 12 megapixels, but yeah, pretty cool. Let's go move on. Moving on into the next tab, which is rear 2, and I've actually left this at focus standard, this button right over here, but feel free to change that to your liking. Center button right over here, I actually mapped it out to white balance, so that way I can access my white balance very easy and very quickly. On my left arrow key, I have it mapped out to my drive mode, so that way I can change my different shooting modes. On my right arrow, I actually have it set to my picture profiles, but personally I never change my picture profile. I'm always on S-Log3 unless I'm taking photos, but that's there if I ever need to touch it. And for my last one, my bottom arrow right over here is my gamma display assist, which again I always leave this on, but it's nice to just have that there. If for whatever reason it turns off, I can turn it back on. Moving on into the next set of tabs, I've actually left movie shooting on this record button right over here. Didn't touch that, but I did actually change my C2 button right over here into focus area, so that way I can change from zone, wide, center, or even flexible spots. Really handy setting that I always use. And then moving on into lens, I actually don't have a custom button for all my lenses, so I actually don't use this. So feel free to actually map that out to whatever you like, but I've just left it as blank. And then yeah, I think that's it. I think that covers all of my custom button. And one final thing that I do want to cover is this FN button right over here. Now you can't actually configure it, but if you actually exit out into your regular camera mode and you hit FN, this is where I can access my steady shot. I can turn off my in-body stabilization if I would like, and also I can adjust my audio record level, as well as change my focus mode, focus area, and picture profile. Just a bunch of different settings that you can quickly access by hitting this FN mode. So I just wanted to kind of let you guys know that that was there. And for some reason I'm not able to actually map out audio record and steady shot on some of these custom buttons, so that is probably one of the best ways to get to those settings, which I actually find that I use quite often. Okay, so now with all those settings dialed in, you should be good to go for getting the highest quality images in your photos as well as videos out of your Sony A7 IV. If you guys have any questions at all about the settings, or if I left anything out, feel free to leave a comment down below and I will try to get back to every single one of you guys. I know this one was a little bit longer and it was actually really long to film and write all this up, but I hope you guys enjoyed today's video and found it helpful. Make sure to check out my custom S-Log3 LUTs if you guys do want to get some awesome colors along with your A7 IV, your S3, or even your FX3, and it greatly supports the channel, so I really appreciate if you guys would check it out. Thank you so much for watching if you made it all the way until the end, and do not forget to drop a like in this video if you did enjoy it, and subscribe if you have not already for more content just like this. With that being said, thank you so much for watching once again, and I will see you guys in the next one. Later.